Your anger is not your problem. Your relationship with your anger is your problem. The emotion itself, the hot, urgent, precisely targeted signal that arrives when something genuinely important has been violated, is one of the most honest things about you. It knows exactly what matters to you. It knows exactly when something has crossed a line. It knows, before your conscious mind has fully processed the situation, that something is wrong and that a response is required. The problem is not the signal. The problem is that most of us were taught, quite early and quite thoroughly, to treat the signal as the noise. We were taught to suppress it, to apologize for it, to manage it away as quickly as possible before it could embarrass us or damage the relationship or confirm something unflattering about our character. Or we were taught to use it as a weapon, to let it flood the situation and dominate the conversation, and produce the compliance that the more patient approach could not achieve. Neither of these is a healthy relationship with anger. Both of them are ways of not actually hearing what the anger is saying. And the anger unheard does not disappear, it deposits. This audiobook is about anger as a teacher, about what it is, where it lives, what it is consistently trying to tell you, and how to develop the specific kind of relationship with it that allows it to inform rather than to govern. Not anger management in the conventional sense of reduction and control. Anger intelligence, the capacity to receive the signal, understand its message, and translate it into the response that the situation and your values actually call for. Part 1. What anger actually is. Anger is a biologically fundamental emotion. It is present in every studied culture, in every age group, in every studied species that has the neural complexity to experience social threat. The neuroscientist Jacques Panksepp, in his work on the effective neuroscience of emotion, identified anger as one of the 7 primary emotional systems, systems that are not culturally learned but genetically inherited, encoded in the subcortical structures of the brain that predate the cortex by tens of millions of years. Anger is older than language, older than human society, older than the moral frameworks that have repeatedly tried to suppress it. Physiologically, anger prepares the organism to act in response to a perceived threat or injustice. The amygdala fires, adrenaline and noradrenaline flood the system, heart rate and blood pressure elevate, muscle tension increases, blood flow is redirected from the digestive system to the large muscles of the limbs, the visual field narrows, the mind focuses with considerable intensity on the source of the threat. This is not a malfunction. It is a precision-engineered response to a specific category of situation, one in which something important has been threatened and action may be required. The psychologist James Averill, in his research on the everyday experience of anger, found that the most common trigger of anger, reported consistently across populations and cultures, is not physical threat or frustration, but what he called arbitrary or avoidable wrongdoing. Someone violated a rule or norm that the person experiencing the anger believed should have been observed. Someone did something they could have chosen not to do, and chose to do it anyway, and the choice caused harm. This is not trivial. It is the anger of an organism with a moral sense encountering a violation of the moral order it has built. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum, in her book Anger and Forgiveness, argues that anger is essentially a response to perceived wrongful damage, to the experience of having something important to you harmed through someone else's choice. She notes, importantly, that this makes anger an inherently evaluative emotion. It is not random. It is not merely physiological arousal looking for a target. It is a precise response to a precise perception. Something valuable has been wrongfully harmed, and the person who caused the harm is responsible for that choice. The anger carries within it both a perception of the world and a judgment about it. This understanding of anger as evaluative and informative changes everything about how to relate to it. If anger is random arousal, then the appropriate response is management, the cooling, the breathing, the technical reduction of the physiological state until it passes. But if anger is the mind's perception of wrongful damage to something important, then suppressing it without hearing its message is like ignoring the fire alarm because the sound is unpleasant. The physiological state is the alarm. The content of the anger, what was harmed, by whose choice, in violation of what is the fire. And the fire needs to be addressed, not just the alarm. The anger you suppress without addressing its message does not disappear. It transforms into the passive-aggressive comment that carries more freight than the situation seems to warrant, into the generalized irritability that cannot attach itself to any specific cause because the specific cause was never acknowledged, into the physical symptoms, the tension, the headaches, the digestive disturbance of a system that has been continuously aroused and continuously denied the discharge that expression and response would provide. The body keeps the score, as the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk's research has documented. And unexpressed anger is among the most reliably embodied of all the things the body keeps. Part 2. What your anger is trying to tell you. Anger is a map. This is the single most useful reframe available in the whole of the anger conversation. Not a map of the other person's failings. Not a map of the situation's injustice. A map of what you value. Because anger is always specifically, precisely, without exception, a response to the perception that something you value has been harmed. The things that consistently make you angry are a detailed, reliable inventory of the things that matter most to you. Consider your most consistent anger triggers, the situations, behaviors, dynamics, and violations that produce anger most reliably. What do they have in common? What are they protecting? The person who consistently becomes angry when their time is disrespected has time. Their time, its finite quality, its irreplaceability as a core value. The person who becomes angry when they observe injustice toward others has fairness and human dignity as core values. The person who becomes angry when their contributions are not acknowledged has a value around recognition and reciprocity. The anger knows. The anger is pointing, with considerable precision, at what matters. The psychologist Harriet Lerner, whose landmark work on the dance of anger has helped more people understand their emotional patterns than perhaps any other contemporary author on the subject, describes anger as a signal worth listening to, not a signal to attack, not a signal to suppress, a signal that something needs attention, that a value has been violated, a boundary has been crossed, a need has been chronically unmet, or a relationship has developed a pattern that is not sustainable. The anger is not the solution, but it is the first, clearest, most honest indication that a problem exists. There is also a distinction worth drawing between primary anger, the direct, proportionate response to a specific violation, and secondary anger, the anger that covers another, more vulnerable emotion. Many people, when they feel hurt, frightened, or humiliated, convert those feelings into anger, because anger is active and outward-facing and feels more powerful than the underlying vulnerability. The secondary anger is real, but it is not the most important message. Underneath it, the primary emotion, the hurt, the fear, the humiliation, is waiting to be acknowledged. And the relationship cannot move forward through the anger alone. It requires contact with what the anger is protecting. The honest examination of anger, the willingness to stay with it long enough to ask what it is actually about, what it is protecting, what it is pointing toward, is one of the most productive forms of self-inquiry available. Not comfortable. The answer often reveals something vulnerable that the anger was covering, but necessary, because the person who knows what their anger is telling them has access to the most honest available map of their own values. And the person who can translate that map into language, who can express not just the anger but the underlying value and need, is the person whose difficult conversations actually go somewhere. Your anger is not your enemy. It is your most honest advisor. The problem has never been the anger. The problem has been the relationship to it, the suppression that denies the message, the explosion that delivers the message in a way that cannot be heard, or the conversion into passivity that protects the relationship at the cost of the person in it. The practice is to develop the capacity to hear the message clearly enough to speak from it rather than through it. To say what the anger knows, in words the relationship can receive. Part 3. The anger you were not allowed to have. Not everyone comes to anger with the same relationship. For many people, particularly women, though not exclusively, there is a specific history with anger that is not about its expression but about its permission. The message, received early and reinforced consistently, that anger is inappropriate, excessive, unattractive, or simply not allowed for someone in your position. That the appropriate response to violation is patient understanding. That expressing anger makes you difficult. That the quality of being easy to be around requires the suppression of the authentic response to things that are genuinely wrong. This message has different content for different people, but a common effect: the disconnection from anger as a legitimate signal. The person who received this message does not simply suppress anger when it arises. They question whether they have the right to feel it. They preemptively apologize for the response they have not yet made. They interpret their own anger as a character flaw, evidence of unreasonableness, of being too sensitive, of having standards that are inconveniently high, rather than as the honest, appropriate, information-carrying signal that it is. The poet Author Lord wrote with extraordinary power about the specific silencing of black women's anger. The way in which the political and social suppression of their rage was not accidental but strategic. Because anger, expressed clearly and without apology, is one of the most powerful instruments available for the communication of injustice and the demand for its correction. What she was describing is true, in varying forms and with varying stakes, for anyone whose anger has been systematically delegitimized. The suppression of the anger is always the suppression of the message the anger carries. The reclamation of the right to anger, the specific, internal acknowledgement that your anger is a legitimate response to genuine violation rather than an embarrassing personality trait, is not about becoming angrier. It is about becoming more honest, about allowing the signal its full value rather than apologizing it into silence before it can be heard. The anger that has been suppressed or delegitimized for years does not emerge, when finally permitted, as a raging flood. It emerges, typically, as clarity, as the precise, settled knowledge of what was wrong, what you will not tolerate going forward, and what the relationship or the situation requires of you now. This clarity is not aggressive. It is the opposite of aggressive. It is the calm, grounded directness of someone who is speaking from their actual experience rather than from the managed version of it. The person who has never allowed themselves to know their own anger speaks from a place of performed tolerance that is always slightly off. The person who has done the work of understanding their anger speaks from a place of genuine equanimity, not the equanimity of suppression, but the equanimity of someone who knows what they value, knows when it has been violated, and has language for saying so clearly. You are allowed to be angry, not as permission to harm anyone, as permission to hear your own signal, to take the message seriously, to ask what it is telling you about what matters and what has been violated. The anger you were not allowed to have is not a wound in your character. It is a wound in your history, and the healing of it begins with the simple, radical act of saying, "This is real, this matters, and I am allowed to know that." Part 4. Anger and Justice, the Social Dimension. There is a category of anger that transcends the personal and enters the political. The anger of witnessing injustice, the specific, visceral response to seeing people treated wrongfully, to observing systems that produce suffering in people who did not deserve it, to encountering the casual cruelty of power applied without accountability. This anger is not only legitimate, it is, many philosophers and theologians have argued, morally required. The person who can witness genuine injustice without anger has either managed to not see it clearly or has decided that it does not concern them. Neither is admirable. The philosopher Aristotle noted that the person who never becomes angry is not in fact serene. They are morally deficient. The appropriate emotional response to genuine wrongdoing is anger. Not the destructive anger that harms indiscriminately, but what he called orge, the measured, proportionate anger that is a natural and appropriate response to injustice, that is directed at the actual wrong. And that motivates the response the situation requires. Aristotle thought the person incapable of this kind of anger was missing something important. The capacity for appropriate anger, he argued, is part of the moral equipment of a fully functioning person. The social psychologist Deborah Small's research on the psychology of moral outrage has shown that anger at injustice, when it is understood and expressed clearly, is one of the most powerful motivators of prosocial behavior. People who can connect with the anger produced by witnessing injustice are more likely to take action to address it than people who manage that anger into neutral concern. The anger is fuel. The question is not whether to have it, but how to direct it. The Stoics, who were generally suspicious of strong emotion, made an exception for what they called the passion for justice. They recognized that a world without people who felt genuine anger at genuine wrongdoing would be a world without advocates, without reformers, without the specific energy required to challenge power and demand accountability. Marcus Aurelius himself expressed anger in his journal, at injustice, at cruelty, at the behavior of those who had the power to do good and chose otherwise. He did not suppress it. He used it as a reminder of what mattered and what he was supposed to be doing with his position. The distinction between anger as a destructive force and anger as a generative one is not about the intensity of the feeling. It is about the clarity of its direction. The destructive anger floods the situation and harms anything in reach, including the people it was not aimed at. The generative anger is precise. It knows what it is responding to. It is directed at the actual source of the wrong, and it produces the specific, targeted response that the wrong requires. This precision is not natural. It is cultivated. Through the practice of understanding your own anger, knowing what it is about, and developing the language to speak it clearly rather than simply discharging it. The world needs your anger, not the unexamined, undirected version that harms the people around you and yourself. The examined, honest, precisely directed version that knows exactly what it is responding to and what it is asking for. The anger that says, "This is wrong, I know why it is wrong, and I am going to do something about it." That anger, in whatever domain it is relevant to your particular life, is one of the most powerful moral tools available to you. The work is not to extinguish it. It is to refine it into the clear, coherent, unstoppable force that genuine moral conviction, fully felt and honestly expressed, has always been. Part 5. The practice of intelligent anger. Intelligent anger is not calm anger. It is not the suppression of the physiological intensity or the pretense of equanimity that is not felt. It is something more difficult and more useful. The capacity to remain cognitively functional, to think, to perceive accurately, to communicate clearly, while fully experiencing the emotional intensity of the anger. To be genuinely angry and simultaneously genuinely thoughtful. To let the anger inform the response, without letting the anger be the entirety of the response. The first practice is the pause between stimulus and response. The anger arrives immediately, automatically, physiologically full. The impulse to act on it equally immediate. Between the arrival and the action there is a space, small at first, expandable with practice. In that space the question, what is this anger actually about? Not to dismiss it, to understand it. What value has been violated? What need has been ignored? What specific wrong has occurred? The clarity that emerges from that question does not cool the anger. It focuses it. It converts the flood into a current. The second practice is the translation of the anger into language, not the expression of the anger in all its physiological intensity. That is rarely received as communication. The translation of what the anger knows into words that can actually be heard. The difference between "you never listened to me" and "when you interrupted me in that meeting, I felt dismissed, and I need you to understand why that matters to me." The first is the anger speaking. The second is the person speaking about what the anger revealed. The second is almost always more effective. It requires the first to be heard, to have the information the anger carries before the words can be found. The psychologist Marshall Rosenberg, who developed the practice of nonviolent communication, described the process of expressing anger cleanly as a four-step movement: observing what actually happened without evaluation, identifying the feeling it produced, identifying the need the feeling reveals, and making a request based on that need. This is not a formula for suppressing anger. It is a framework for communicating what the anger is telling you in a form that can actually change the situation. Because the anger's purpose, ultimately, is to produce a change, and the change is more likely to occur through communication that can be heard than through expression that can only be defended against. The third practice is the ongoing cultivation of anger literacy, the ability to accurately identify your own anger states before they reach the threshold of expression. Mild irritation is the early warning. Frustration is the middle stage. Full anger is the mature signal. Each of these is useful information. Each of them is accessible. If you develop the habit of checking in with your own emotional state regularly enough that the earlier signals are caught before the intensity of the full anger, makes thoughtful response more difficult. The fire you were never taught to use is one of the most powerful resources available to you, not as a weapon, as a signal, as a motivator, as the precise and honest voice of everything you value and everything you will not allow to be violated without response. Anger, understood and used intelligently, is not a character flaw to be managed. It is a human capacity to be developed, to be refined into the clear, honest, precisely targeted force that knows what it is responding to, knows what it is asking for, and speaks that truth in a way that can actually be heard. That anger, not suppressed, not exploded, but genuinely used, is one of the most alive things about you.